Imagine losing someone in 1979 and only 30 years later does an unexpected lead appear. A grandmother marked by longing walks through a newly renovated park, and there, engraved on a bench, is the name she has never forgotten, that of her missing grandson. What did this name mean there? Who wrote it? Get ready for a true story full of secrets, emotions, and a reunion that time almost erased. October 1979 showed its best side in Munich. The trees in the English garden glowed in warm gold and red tones, and the afternoon sun bathed the expansive meadows in a soft light. Margaret Fisher, an energetic woman in her mid-60s with silver-gray hair and bright blue eyes, stood at the stove in her cozy apartment in Schwabing, stirring a pot of steaming pumpkin soup. "Klaus, dinner will be ready in 10 minutes," she called toward the small room her 12-year-old grandson had occupied for the past 3 years. No answer. Margaret smiled indulgently. Klaus was probably engrossed in one of his books again, or composing little melodies on his keyboard. The boy had an extraordinary talent for music that impressed even his teachers at the music school. She continued stirring the soup and thought back to the day when her daughter Brigitte and her husband Thomas had died in a car accident on the A9. Klaus, then 9 years old, had miraculously survived with nothing but a broken arm and memories no child should have. Margaret had not hesitated to restructure her retirement as a primary school teacher and take over guardianship of her grandson. The first few months had been difficult. Klaus barely spoke, waking up screaming from nightmares and clinging to his keyboard, his parents' last gift, as if it were a lifeline in stormy seas. But slowly, with infinite patience and love, Margaret had broken through the walls the boy had built around his heart. "Music speaks when words fail," Klaus had told her a few weeks ago as she listened to him practicing. It was one of those moments when the 12-year-old showed a wisdom that went far beyond his years. Margaret turned down the heat and went to her grandson's room. She knocked lightly on the door. "Klaus, did you hear me? The food will be ready soon." Again, no answer. She carefully opened the door. The room was empty. The keyboard was on the small desk. Next to it lay an open music book with handwritten notes. The window was closed. The bed was neatly made. On the bedside table was a framed photo of Brigitte and Thomas, both laughing with a little Klaus between them. Margaret felt a twinge of concern, but it quickly disappeared. Klaus was a responsible boy. He had probably gone briefly to the English garden, which was only a few minutes away from her apartment. He loved sitting there under the old oak trees and composing melodies, inspired by the sounds of nature and the rushing of the Eisbach. She went back to the kitchen and looked at the clock just after 4. They had agreed that Klaus would always be back by dinner time, especially now that the days have gotten shorter. Margaret decided to give him another half hour before she went looking. The minutes passed agonizingly slowly. The soup simmered. The scent of pumpkin and ingwa filled the apartment. Outside, dusk began to fall, and a cool wind rustled the leaves on the trees. Umber put on Margaret's warm coat, tied a scarf around her neck, and made her way to the English garden. The park was still well attended at this hour. Joggers ran along the curved paths, students sat in groups on the lawns, and dog owners strolled with their four-legged friends through the falling leaves. Margaret walked purposefully to Klaus's favorite place, an old oak tree near the Eisbach, from where one could hear the sound of the water and at the same time see the towers of Munich's Frauenkirche in the distance. But the place was empty, a trace of a boy with dark blonde hair and a worn brown leather bag in which he always carried his music book and a small cassette recorder. "Excuse me," Margaret said to a passing jogger. "Have you perhaps seen a boy, 12 years old, dark blonde hair, probably wearing a blue jacket and a brown leather bag?" The man shook his head regretfully and walked on. Margaret asked other park visitors, but no one could remember seeing a boy who matched Klaus's description. The worry, which had initially been only a quiet whisper, swelled to a loud roar. Margaret systematically searched the area, repeatedly calling Klaus's name, searching behind bushes and trees. Dusk gave way to darkness, and the lanterns along the park paths were switched on, casting ghostly shadows on the ground. After an hour of fruitless searching, Margaret returned to the apartment, desperately hoping that Klaus might have come home in the meantime. But the apartment was quiet and empty. The pumpkin soup had long since gone cold. With trembling hands, she dialed the police number. "Munich Police Headquarters. How can I help you?" My grandson, Margaret began. Her voice was shaky with fear. He has disappeared. He is only 12 years old. It should have been in the English garden, but I can't find it anywhere. The next few hours blurred into a nightmare of questions, forms, and growing despair. Police officers entered the apartment, took Margaret's statement, and asked about Klaus's habits, friends, and possible reasons for a voluntary disappearance. Has your grandson shown any unusual behavior recently? Was he depressed? Did he have problems at school or with friends? Margaret shook her head at every question. Klaus was a well-balanced child, despite the trauma he had experienced. He had good grades, especially in music and mathematics. He had some close friends with whom he met regularly. There was no apparent reason why he should run away. We will immediately launch a search in the English garden, an officer assured her, and we will relay his description to all patrol cars. Most missing children reappear within the first 24 hours. But Klaus didn't show up again. Not in the first 24 hours, not in the first week, not in the first month. Police searched the English garden and the surrounding areas. Divers searched the icebox, although there was no evidence that Klaus could have fallen into the water. Klaus's photo was published in newspapers, shown on television, displayed on song pillars and in public buildings. Witnesses came forward. An elderly lady remembered seeing a boy who looked like Klaus in the park on the afternoon of his disappearance. He had been sitting alone on a bench, writing in a notebook. A street musician thought he saw the boy near the Chinese tower listening to a group of musicians. A taxi driver said he saw a boy matching Klaus's description at the edge of the park, accompanied by a tall man wearing a hat and a dark coat. I thought it was his father or a relative, the taxi driver said. They talked. It didn't look like coercion. The man had his hand on the boy's shoulder, but not in a threatening way. This last statement triggered a new direction in the investigation. Who was this man? None of Klaus's relatives or acquaintances fit the description. Was it a stranger? Had he spoken to Klaus and persuaded him to come along? The investigators questioned Klaus's music teacher, his schoolmates, and his neighbors. No one had noticed such a man in Klaus's environment. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere and taken the boy with him. Where and why remained a mystery. Weeks turned into months. Months turned into years. Margaret refused to give up hope. She kept Klaus's room exactly as he had left it. She celebrated his birthday every year, buying gifts that she kept in his closet. She kept the investigation going as best she could, saved her money for private investigators, continued to distribute leaflets, and talked to anyone who might have seen something. The police had other theories. Maybe Klaus had run away for reasons known only to him. Maybe he was the victim of an accident. His body was never found, right? And this possibility was the one Margaret feared most. He had become a victim of a crime. When the Berlin Wall fell in 1989 and Germany was reunified, new hope briefly emerged. Maybe Klaus had somehow made it to the east. Perhaps opening the borders would bring new information. Margaret traveled to Berlin, spoke with authorities, and searched archives. But this trail also came to nothing. In the quiet hours of the night, when the pain was at its worst, Margaret would sometimes sit at Klaus's keyboard and try to play the simple melodies he had composed. The notes he had lovingly written in his notebook blurred before her tear-filled eyes. "Where are you, my boy?" she whispered into the darkness. "What happened to you that autumn day?" There was no answer, only the echo of her own voice in the empty apartment and the gentle ticking of the clock, relentlessly measuring the time that passed without Klaus. What Margaret couldn't have known was that 3 decades later, a chance discovery on a renovated park bench in downtown Munich would lift the veil of mystery and reveal a story as incredible as the melodies her grandson had once composed. Before we reveal the end of this story, give us a like and subscribe to our channel. We are close to reaching 2,000 weighted subscribers, and only you can be part of this success. The time after Klaus's disappearance was like an endless winter for Margaret. The days melted into weeks, the weeks into months, and soon years passed without her grandson. Her apartment in Schwabing, once filled with piano melodies and a boy's laughter, was now a silent shrine of memories. Every morning, Margaret got up at 7 o'clock, made herself a strong coffee, and sat down at the small kitchen table that looked out the window. From there, she could observe the street, the people on their way to work, the children on their way to school. Sometimes she imagined she saw a boy with dark blonde hair among them, and her heart would stop for a moment, only to start beating twice as fast when she realized it wasn't Klaus. Would she even recognize him? He would be a young man now, no longer the 12-year-old boy whose picture was yellowing in her wallet. "Mrs. Fisher, you must try to move on with your life," the police commissioner said when the official search was called off after a year. "We keep the case in our files, but without any new leads." He hadn't finished the sentence, but Margaret understood. For the police, Klaus was just one of many missing people, a name in a file that kept slipping further and further down the pile. To her, he was everything. In the second year after his disappearance, Margaret began writing letters to Klaus. It was an idea her therapist had suggested, a way to process her thoughts and feelings, to maintain a connection with her grandson, even if she didn't know if he would ever read her words. "My dear Klaus," began the first letter, written on his 14th birthday. "Today you would have turned 14. I baked a chocolate cake, your favorite cake, and lit a candle. I imagine you blowing out the candle and making a wish. What would you wish for, my boy? All I wish is that you are safe and happy wherever you may be, and that you find your way home one day." The letters became a ritual. Every month, Margaret sat down at Klaus's desk, pulled out a piece of paper, and wrote down everything that had happened in her life, what she felt, and what she hoped for him. She told him about the changes in Munich, about political events, about music that he would have liked. "The Berlin Wall has fallen, Klaus," she wrote in November 1999. "Germany will be reunited. People are celebrating in the streets. I wonder if you're celebrating somewhere with me. I went to Berlin and left your name with the authorities. In case you're in the East. Is that possible? Have you been only a few hundred kilometers away all these years, separated by a wall and a political system? I'm waiting here for you, my boy. I will always wait." The letters soon filled a shoebox, then two, then three. Margaret kept them in Klaus's room, neatly stacked next to his keyboard, which she regularly dusted and tuned, as if he might return at any moment and want to play. Parallel to the letters, Margaret continued her own investigation. She had found a small circle of supporters, other parents of missing children, retired police officers, people who had been touched by Klaus's story. They met once a month in a cafe near the English Garden, exchanged information, and planned new searches. "There is a new technology called the Internet," a young man named Stefan explained to her in 1995. He was the son of a friend and worked as a programmer. "We could publish Klaus's story and photo there. It would reach many more people than flyers." Margaret, now overconfident but still sharp-witted and determined, allowed Stefan to introduce her to this new world. She learned how to use a computer, set up an email address, and search forums for information. The technology was foreign to her, but she quickly understood its value in her search. A website was created, "Where is Klaus Fisher?" with Klaus's photo, his story, and contact information. Margaret learned how to search for similar cases, how to contact other families of missing persons, and how to search databases. "You'd be proud of your grandma," she wrote in one of her letters. "I'm online now, as the young people say. I'm looking for you in a world that didn't exist when you disappeared. Isn't that strange? The world keeps turning, inventing new things, and yet time seems to stand still for me, trapped in that October day in 1929. The years passed, the new millennium came, and with it Klaus's 33rd birthday. Margaret, now in her late 20s, had become physically frailer, but her mind remained sharp, her determination unbroken. She had now amassed a considerable amount of information about missing persons and had become a kind of unofficial expert, to whom the police sometimes even turned. "Mrs. Fisher," said a young police officer who visited her at home, said her work has helped other families find their missing loved ones. "You have built a network that is more valuable than you may know." Margaret smiled tiredly. "But I didn't find my Klaus." The policeman remained respectfully silent. What could he say? That after so many years the chances were vanishingly small, that maybe she should learn to let go. These words had been said too many times by too many people, and they had never made any difference. In her 90th year, Margaret suffered a mild stroke. The doctors advised her to move into a nursing home, but she steadfastly refused. "I can't go," she said to her niece Helga. the daughter of her deceased brother, who had traveled from Hamburg to take care of her. What if Klaus comes home and I'm not here? Helga, a warm-hearted woman in her 50s, understood her aunt's fear. She had never met Klaus, but Margaret's stories made her feel as if she had. The stories about the musically gifted boy, his compositions, his laughter, had become part of the family memory. Then I'll move in with you, Aunt Margaret, Helga decided. I can work from here and we'll wait together in case Klaus comes back. So Helga moved into the small apartment in Schwabing, which had been waiting for the return of a boy for over 30 years. She slept on the sofa in the living room because Klaus's room had to remain untouched. She learned about her aunt's routines, drinking morning coffee by the window, dusting Klaus's keyboard, writing monthly letters, and meeting with the support group. Helga also took over the administration of the website and the email address. Messages arrived almost daily, mostly encouraging words from strangers, sometimes clues, but they always turned out to be dead ends. You know, Margrethe said one evening as they drank tea together, sometimes I wonder if I did the right thing by never giving up, if it was selfish not to let go. Helga took her aunt's hand. It was love, Aunt Margaret, the purest form of love. In the winter of 2008, Margaret's health deteriorated rapidly. Another stroke, more severe this time, left her bedridden. The doctors didn't give her much time left. Helga, she whispered one evening, her voice barely audible. Promise me something. Everything, Auntie, when I'm gone, keep looking for him, and when you find him, give him the letters, all the letters. He should know that I never stopped loving him, never stopped hoping. Helga swallowed hard and nodded. I promise. Margaret Fisher died peacefully in January 2009, a month before Klaus's 42nd birthday. Until her last breath, she held a photograph of her grandson, the image of a smiling 12-year-old with dark blonde hair and alert eyes, who had a life ahead of him that was stolen from him. The funeral was small, but the church was full. People whose lives Margaret had touched, other families of missing persons, former students, neighbors, police officers who had worked on Klaus's case, came to say goodbye to a woman whose love and determination had inspired them. Helga kept her promise. She moved into her aunt's apartment, continued the search, maintained contacts, and updated the website. She even continued writing the monthly letters in Margaret's name, as if her aunt could continue speaking through her. Dear Klaus, she wrote in February 2009, today you would have turned 42. Your grandma isn't here to celebrate your birthday anymore, but I'm sure she's celebrating it, wherever she is now. She never stopped loving you, never stopped looking for you. And I won't do it either. I am Helga, your great-uncle's daughter. I only know you from stories, but I feel connected to you. If you're reading this, come home. There is someone waiting for you. In spring 2009, the city of Munich began renovating Marienplatz, the city's historic center. Old benches were dismantled, restored, and given a fresh coat of paint. Helga noticed the work on her daily walk, but paid little attention to it. Her thoughts were on an upcoming meeting with a retired detective who claimed to have new information about a similar missing person case from the late 1970s. Little did she know that one of those restored benches contained a secret that had been hidden under layers of paint for 30 years, a secret that would come to light in a few weeks and change her life forever. A name carved into wood, a name that was never forgotten. Klaus Fischer, 1979. Spring 2009 held Munich firmly in its grip. The chestnut trees along the streets bore their white blossoms. The cafes had put their tables outside, and the city was vibrant with life and color after the long winter. Marienplatz, the historic heart of Munich, was the scene of a comprehensive renovation, part of a city project to beautify the city center before Oktoberfest. Helga Fischer set out early on this sunny May morning. Since her Aunt Margaret's death 4 months earlier, she had adopted her habits, as if this would help her maintain contact with her and with Klaus. Every morning a coffee by the window, every afternoon a walk through the city, every evening a look into Klaus's untouched room before she went to sleep. At 56, Helga was an attractive woman with short silver-gray hair and the same bright blue eyes that had distinguished her aunt. She wore a light jacket over her blouse, a shoulder bag with Klaus's photo in it, and a notebook in case she noticed something important. Marienplatz was a hubbub of activity that morning. Workers in orange vests moved between barriers. Tourists photographed the magnificent new town hall with its famous carillon, and businessmen hurried to their offices with coffee in hand. Helga made her way through the crowd, nodded to the flower seller who now knew her, and sat down on one of the few benches that had already been renovated and put back in place. From here she had a good view of the action and could enjoy the morning sun bathing the square in golden light. She opened her notebook and began to organize her thoughts for the day. The meeting with the retired detective was scheduled for the afternoon. He had indicated on the phone that he saw connections between several missing persons cases from the late 1970s. Children with special talents who disappeared without a trace. Klaus, with his exceptional musical talent, fit this pattern. "Excuse me, is this seat free?" Helga looked up. An elderly gentleman with a friendly face and a well-groomed white beard stood in front of her and pointed to the empty seat next to her on the bench. "Of course," she said, moving aside a bit, even though there was plenty of room. The man sat down with a grateful sigh. "These new benches are a blessing for my old bones, much more comfortable than the old ones." Helga smiled politely. "Yeah, the city's doing a good job with the renovation, you know," the man continued, obviously in a chatty mood. "I'm working on the project, not out here with the young guys. I'm too old for the hard work. But in the workshop where we restore the old benches, Helga's interest was piqued. "Oh, really? That sounds like an interesting job." "That's it. You wouldn't believe what we find under the old layers of paint. Declarations of love, tributes of fruit, works of art. The benches are like an archive of the city's history." "Did you find anything particularly interesting?" Helga asked, more out of politeness than genuine interest. The man leaned back and looked at the space in front of them. "A few days ago, we sanded down a bench from the 1970s. Beneath it appeared a name, neatly carved with a date of 1979 and a small line of music next to it." Helga's heart skipped a beat. 1979, the year Klaus disappeared, and music, Klaus's passion. "What name?" she asked, trying to hide her sudden tension. "Klaus Fischer," the man replied. "A beautiful name, I think. We decided to preserve the inscription. We usually sand everything down, but this one was so neatly done, almost artistic with the music next to it. My boss said it's part of the bench's history." The world around Helga seemed to stand still. The sounds of the square faded to a distant murmur. Klaus Fischer, her long-lost second cousin, the boy her aunt had searched for 30 years, his name carved into a bench in the year of his disappearance. "Where? Where is this bench now?" she finally managed, her voice barely above a whisper. The man looked at her in wonder, surprised by her intense reaction. "It was put back in place yesterday, right over there near the fish fountain. It's one of the dark green ones with the ornate armrests." Helga stood up so abruptly that her notebook fell to the floor. She hastily picked it up, mumbled an apology, and hurried in the direction indicated. Her heart pounded in her chest. The fish fountain was surrounded by tourists throwing coins into the water and taking photos. Helga pushed her way through the crowd. Her eyes searched feverishly for the dark green benches. There were 3 of them, freshly painted and gleaming in the morning sun. The first bench was empty. On the second sat a young mother with a stroller. The third was free. Helga sat down, her hands shaking as she felt the surface, searching for traces. Nothing. The surface was smooth, newly varnished. Had the man made a mistake? Was it a different bench? Or had he played a cruel joke, perhaps having heard its name and known its history? Then her gaze fell on the underside of the seat. There, protected from the elements in direct contact, a small section of the original wooden surface had been exposed and covered with a protective clear film, like a window into the past. Helga bent down, her heart racing. And there, carved in careful, childish handwriting, was the name Klaus Fischer. Beneath it the date October 14th, 1979, the day of his disappearance, in a short sequence of notes that Helga couldn't read, but which she immediately recognized as Klaus's handwriting from the music still lying in his room. A sob escaped her throat, half joy, half pain. She touched the protected inscription with trembling fingers, as if she could make a connection through the wood to the boy who had sat here 30 years ago and immortalized his name. "Excuse me, are you all right?" A young woman with a worried face stood before her. Helga realized that tears were running down her cheeks and that she was hunched oddly over the bench. "Yes," she said, straightening up and wiping away the tears. "Yes, I'm all right, better than all right. I just found something very important." The woman nodded uncertainly and continued walking. Helga sat up straight again. Her head was buzzing with thoughts and questions. What did this discovery mean? Had Klaus made the inscription before or after his meeting with the mysterious man? Was it an intentional legacy? A message of some kind? And why here at Marienplatz, far from the English garden where he had last been seen? With sudden determination, she pulled her cell phone from her pocket and called the number of the retired detective she was supposed to meet that afternoon. "Mr. Weber, this is Helger Fischer. Can we move our meeting up? I found something you need to see. It's about Klaus." An hour later, Helger was back at the bench, this time accompanied by Richard Weber, a gaunt man with sharp eyes and a calm, methodical manner. He had worked for over 20 years with the Munich Criminal Investigation Department before retiring and had worked on numerous missing persons cases, including, briefly, Klaus's. Weber knelt down next to bench and examined the inscription thoroughly, taking photographs with a professional camera and measuring the spacing of the letters with a small ruler. "The handwriting matches the samples we have of Klaus," he confirmed after comparing the photographs with documents in his folder. And the date, October 14th, 1979, was the day of his disappearance. "What does that mean?" Helga asked, standing nervously beside him. Weber slowly straightened up, his face thoughtful. "It means that Klaus was here at Marienplatz that day, not in the English garden, as we always assumed, but the witnesses saw him in the English garden in the early afternoon. No one knows what happened after that. Perhaps he came here to Marienplatz. Perhaps this is where he met the mysterious man." Helga sat down on the bench, overwhelmed by the implications. "30 years, she murmured. "For 30 years we've been looking in the wrong place." Weber sat down next to her. "Not necessarily in the wrong place, but perhaps with incomplete information. This discovery opens up new possibilities." He pulled a notebook from his pocket and began writing quickly. "We need to review the police files from that time. Look for witness statements from Marienplatz. Perhaps there are reports that were never connected to Klaus's case because no one knew he was here." Helga stared at the inscription under the bench. The music line particularly fascinated her. "Can you read this music?" she asked. Weber shook his head. "I'm not musical, but we can call in an expert." "I know someone," said Helga, "a music teacher who taught Klaus. He is now retired, but he still lives here in Munich. He would certainly help us." Weber nodded in agreement. "Excellent. Every detail could be important." They agreed to meet with the music teacher the next day. When Weber said goodbye, Helga remained sitting on the bench, unable to part with this place that had suddenly taken on such deep meaning for her. The sun was now high in the sky and Marienplatz was full of life. Tourists, local street musicians. They all moved around Helga, unaware that she was sitting on a piece of history, a fragment of a 30-year-old mystery. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine what it had looked like here on that October day in 1979. Like a 12-year-old boy with dark blonde hair, sat on that bench and carved his name into the wood, along with a piece of music that was important enough to him to immortalize. What happened next? Who had approached him? Where had he gone? When Helga opened her eyes again, she felt that she was closer to the answer than ever before in the 30 years since Klaus disappeared. The bank had kept a secret, and now it was up to them to put the remaining pieces of the puzzle together. With renewed determination, she stood up and made her way to the apartment that had once belonged to her aunt and was now her home. She had to find Klaus's old music books and understand what the carved melody meant. "I'm on your trail, Klaus," she whispered, taking one last look at the bench. "After all these years, I'm finally on your trail." What Helga couldn't have guessed was that the carved melody was more than just a random piece of music. It was a key to a life that had existed in secret for 30 years, far away from Munich, but never completely cut off from its roots. A life that would soon collide with hers in a way no one could have foreseen. The little melody that Klaus had carved into the bench at Marienplatz turned out to be the key that would break 30 years of silence. Professor Erich Hoffmann, Klaus's former music teacher, recognized them immediately when Helga showed him the photos. "This is no ordinary sequence of notes," said the old man in a trembling voice, adjusting his thick glasses. "This is the beginning of a composition Klaus wrote shortly before his disappearance. He called it Dresden Memories, although, as far as I know, he never visited Dresden." "Dresden?" Helga asked in surprise. "Why Dresden?" The professor shrugged his shoulders. "He told me the melody appeared to him in a dream, along with images of a city he had never visited, but recognized as Dresden from postcards or books, I guess. He was a special child with a vivid imagination." This information electrified Richard Weber. "Dresden was then in the GDR," he explained. "If there is a connection to Dresden, that could explain why we never found any trace of Klaus. Maybe he was taken across the border." The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Weber reactivated old contacts at the police and requested files that had become available since the fall of the wall. Helga scoured the internet for musicians and composers from Dresden who had emerged in the last 30 years. "There is a composer," she said excitedly to Weber one evening as they sat in the apartment, bent over documents. "Karl Neumann. He appeared in Dresden in the early 1980s as a young music student. Today he is a respected composer and music professor at the Dresden University of Music." Weber looked skeptical. This could be a coincidence. Many young musicians begin their careers in their 20s. "But listen," Helga continued, "his biography is Libra. No mention of his childhood or family and his first published composition." She turned the laptop to Weber. "It's called Memories of a Forgotten Place. And listen to this." She played an audio recording. The first bars were unmistakable, a worked-out version of the melody that Klaus had carved into the bench. Weber's eyes widened. This can't be a coincidence. 2 days later, Helga and Weber were on a train to Dresden. The journey was mostly silent, everyone lost in their own thoughts. Helga stared out the window at the passing scenery, wondering if she was really close to finding the boy after her aunt had spent her entire life searching, or would it just be another disappointment, another dead end in a 30-year search? Dresden welcomed them with a bright blue sky. The city, with its rebuilt Frauenkirche and the elegant Baroque buildings along the Elbe, was breathtakingly beautiful. Helga could understand why she would inspire a young musician, even if he only knew her from books. They had arranged a meeting with Professor Karl Neumann at the Music Academy under the pretext of researching a documentary about German composers. The college was an imposing building with high windows through which piano music and singing could be heard outside. They waited nervously in the professor's office. Helga had Klaus's photo in her bag, along with one of the letters Margaret had written. She had no idea how she would react if the man who was about to walk through that door was actually Klaus. The door opened and a middle-aged man entered. He was tall and slim, with dark blonde hair that was graying at the temples and thin metal-framed glasses. His movements were precise, almost elegant like those of a conductor. "Ms. Fischer, Mr. Weber, welcome to Dresden. I am Karl Neumann." His voice was deep and melodic with a slight Saxon accent. He smiled politely, but there was a certain caution in his eyes. Helga stared at him, unable to speak. The resemblance was unmistakable. The same shape of his face, the same expressive eyes, the same way he tilted his head slightly to the side, as in the photos of Klaus as a child. Weber took over the conversation, explained her alleged documentary, and asked questions about Neumann's career and compositions. The professor answered eloquently, but Libra when it came to his early years. "And Memories of a Forgotten Place?" Weber finally asked. "What inspired you to create this piece?" A barely perceptible tension ran through Neumann's body. "Childhood memory," he said after a brief pause. "Places that exist only in my memory." Helga couldn't contain herself any longer. She pulled the photo of Klaus from her bag and placed it on the table between them. "Do you know this boy, Professor?" Neumann froze, his eyes fixed on the photo, and for a moment all the color seemed to drain from his face. His hand, which had been on the table, withdrew, as if he had been burned. "Where did you get this?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's my second cousin," Helga replied. Her heart raced. Klaus Fischer. He disappeared in Munich in 1972. His grandmother searched for him for 30 years. She died in January without ever finding him again. Neumann stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to them. His shoulders were tense, his hands clenched into fists. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, but his voice trembled. "I was born in Leipzig. I grew up in the GDR." Helga now pulled out the photos of the bench. Before his disappearance, Klaus carved his name and a melody into a bench at Marktplatz. This melody, she placed the photos next to the childhood picture. The same melody with which her play, Memories of a Forgotten Place, begins. Neumann turned slowly. His eyes were moist, his face a mask of shock and fear. "You can't prove I'm that boy," he said, but it sounded more like a question than a statement. "No," Helga admitted, "but a DNA test could. I'm Klaus's cousin. We share genetic material." Neumann sank back into his chair, suddenly seeming like a much older man. "What do you want?" he asked quietly. "Money? A scandal? Ruining my career?" "None of that," Helga answered gently. "I just want to know what happened to the boy my aunt loved so much, the boy she spent her life searching for." A long silence followed. Outside, someone was practicing Chopin. The melancholy notes floated through the open windows. Finally, Neumann or Klaus began to speak, his voice quiet but clear. "I was 12, he said. "I was sitting on a bench at Mariplatz, composing. A man approached me, said he was impressed by my talent. He showed me photos of a music school in Dresden, told me about the opportunities there, about the training I could receive." He paused, collected himself. "I was naive. I went with him to find out more. He gave me something to drink, and when I woke up, I was on a train. We crossed the border with forged papers. I was now Karl Neumann, an orphan from Leipzig." "Why?" Helga asked. "Why them?" "Talent search," he explained bitterly. "The GDR was looking for gifted children for its elite programs in art, sports, and science. Sometimes they were recruited legally, sometimes not, and they never tried to escape, to return after the fall of the wall." Klaus, for now he was Klaus again in Helga's mind, laughed humorlessly. "Where to?" At that point, Karl Neumann had been my identity for over a decade. I had a career, obligations, and I was afraid. Afraid of the legal consequences, afraid of what would become of my life if the truth came out. He took the photo of his younger son in his own hand, looking at it with a mixture of tenderness and pain, and I was afraid that no one would be there to remember me. "Grandmother, she never stopped looking for you," Helga interrupted gently. "Never stopped loving you." She pulled out one of the letters Margaret had written and handed it to Klaus. He took it with trembling hands, opened it carefully, and began to read. Tears filled his eyes and streamed freely down his cheeks. "She wrote to me," he whispered incredulously. "All these years, every month," confirmed Helga. "There are hundreds of letters. They are waiting for you." Klaus closed his eyes, overwhelmed by emotions. When he opened them again, something inside him seemed to have broken, but in a healing way, like a dam breaking and releasing long-held water. "I never forgot her," he said. "In my music, in my dreams. It was always there. Munich was always there. I composed to remember, to not lose the connection." He stood up, went to a cupboard, and pulled out an old, worn leather bag. The same bag that 12-year-old Klaus had been carrying when he disappeared. From it, he pulled a yellowed music book. "My first compositions," he explained. "I've kept them all these years. They were my only connection to who I once was." Helga and Klaus spent the rest of the day talking, crying, and filling in 30 years of teaching. Weber discreetly withdrew, but promised to return the next day to discuss the legal aspects of the situation. That evening, Helga and Klaus walked along the Elbe River, which glittered in the light of the setting sun. The rebuilt city around them seemed symbolic of the possibility of renewal, of reconstruction after destruction. "What happens now?" Klaus asked as they sat on a bench by the riverbank. "That's up to you," Helga replied. "Your identity, your life here. I didn't come to take that away from you." Klaus looked at the city that had been his home for 30 years. "Karl Neumann has become real," he said thoughtfully. "His career, his friendships, his music, all of it is real. But Klaus Fischer," he touched the bag in which he kept Margaret's letter. "Klaus Fischer has a family that has never forgotten him. Maybe the two don't have to stay separated," Helga suggested. "Maybe Karl and Klaus can coexist." Klaus smiled. the first real smile Helga had ever seen. It reminded her of the photos of the 12-year-old boy who had been so suddenly torn from her aunt's life. "I would like to come to Munich," he said, seeing the apartment, reading the letters, and he hesitated. "I would like to visit grandmother's grave." Helga took his hand and squeezed it tightly. "She would be so happy to know that you are alive, that you make music." That was all she ever wanted. When she returned to her hotel room later, Helga called Weber to tell him about the developments. The retired detective listened attentively. "It's a miracle," he said when she had finished, "after all these years." "No miracle," Helga replied. "Only the persistence of a grandmother who never gave up and a name on a bench that had waited 30 years to be found." That night, Helga slept deeply and dreamlessly for the first time in months. In another part of town, Klaus sat at his piano, softly playing the melody he had composed as a child, the melody he had carved into a bench shortly before his life was changed forever. Only this time, he wasn't playing it as a memory of a forgotten, not just a place, but as a bridge to a future where past and present could finally be reconciled. The lost melody had found its voice again, and with it a man who had been trapped between two identities, two lives, two worlds for 30 years. The story of Klaus Fischer, the missing boy from Munich, had finally found its final chapter. Not as a tragedy, but as an unexpected homecoming. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like the video, and activate notifications so you don't miss any of our upcoming stories. See you soon. M.